if you're up for it, I think part of what I want to do is, as we talk about these issues, I want to have in mind, not exclusively, but just as like an example, the like a teenager, someone who's in college, maybe someone in their 20s who is sort of operating on autopilot, doing the scroll thing, kind of a the algorithm is the master of their activities and their interests and sort of thing, and but they might want to kind of get out of that sort of thing. So that's at least one example that I have in mind. But um maybe what how we can start is, I know that you have just a vast knowledge of the history in philosophy of this topic of the good life, and not everybody is familiar with that history, and that like the good life is even a topic in philosophy. Maybe they expect it to be a topic in psychology, which it is, but maybe if you could just sort of like give us an overview, where does the good life, where is it situated within kind of the history of philosophy? Where did it get started?
Yeah, thank you. So within Western philosophy, it begins with Plato and Aristotle, right? Our most ancient philosophers. They both Plato was Aristotle's teacher, of course, but Plato looked around and he saw people within these small Greek societies very much combating for things like honor, wealth, reputation, and, Plato's looking around and thinking, well, these people are all kind of off track here, right? So he fundamentally thought that the good life was not all about external rewards, right? It was not about fortune, wealth, reputation. But he thought it was, if we looked inside, we could understand how it is that we could reach a internal state that will allow us to have a good life. And he thought it was a state of like internal harmony. So he thought the secret to living a good life was to develop this state of internal harmony that we get through being just. And so he really kicked off the ball, got us rolling there. But Aristotle came in and put much more exclusive focus on what is the good life, what is the nature of the good life. And Aristotle comes around and introduces really quite, sorry, Aristotle comes around and really brings to the forefront the notion of flourishing, what he called eudaimonia. And this concept uh, has evolved from Aristotle in some different directions, but essentially it remains the same concept that he was after then. And for Aristotle, flourishing, the Greek word is eudaimonia, and that was all about using our distinctive characteristic, which is reason, to control our emotions and to allow us to develop habits so that we are feeling in the right ways where reason is determining what's right. And so eudaimonia, as Aristotle is developing it, is very much this concept of human flourishing that is characteristic by rational activity. And so he laid out this concept of eudaimonia, and it has been really influential throughout the history of philosophy, right? So psychologists now study eudaimonia in the psychological context. Philosophers have developed Aristotle's view. I've done my own kind of work on this, where I take the psychological concept of eudaimonia and I try to modernize it to think about whether or not essentially this aspect of virtue is essential to eudaimonia. In Aristotle's analysis, rational activity, the best kind of rational activity, was virtuous, right? So virtue is an excellence of character, and rational activity, right? And its excellence is the state of flourishing. And so in my first academic book, what I do is I think about what psychologists understand, how psychologists understand the concept of flourishing now, and then I try to figure out whether or not virtue is a really important part of it.
Great, that's really helpful. I appreciate that. So, there are a couple, maybe like kind of fundamental ideas going on there. I mean, there's the philosophical, there's the psychological, and do you see that as in the philosophical literature, let's say strict philosophical literature, we're dealing with like the normative, like what should a good life look like? what should you do to have, there's sort of like a some sort of standard or something. And then on the psychological, maybe it's more descriptive, what's correlated with the good life. Is that too clean of a break? I mean, there's got to be a lot of overlap, but how do you see those two disciplines and questions interacting in your work?
Yeah, I agree with that fundamental way of getting at it, right? Psychologists are all about describing states of mind, right? And philosophers are about taking those analyses of states of mind, right? And thinking about what we, in the context of morality, thinking about what we ought to do given how our minds are like. And there are some aspects of psychology that very much border on a more normative account. That's what we call these oughts. And so, for example, I've worked a lot within self determination theory, which is a theory of human motivation. And self determination theory tells us a lot about when we're acting in ways that are conducive to our minds, right? So thinking about innate psychological needs, right? We all have a need to relate or belong, and so we do better, right, when we hang out with friends and fulfill our need to belong. And so there's a very, from that basis, there's an ought that very clearly follows from that, which is what we ought to hang out with our friends. But in what I think more as philosophers, what we're doing when we engage with psychology is to really think about the larger context. So, right, sort of thinking about how, yes, we ought to engage, make social connections, but how does that figure into a bigger life, right? And in my case, I'm interested in how that figures into living a good life.
Good. And so, what comes to mind, at least for me, when I hear that sort, and it's really helpful. And maybe you get this from students. I know that I've had some students in class sort of ask a similar question to this, but it's something like, well, look, picture someone who they are really, let's say, satisfied or content with being kind of a hermit on their own, and maybe they don't have much social connection. And you could go on down the list of things that are sort of, let's say, like abnormal for what we might consider sort of like a flourishing. And then the thought is like, look, for this person, if they are content with being alone and not no books around, or like whatever it is. I think Rawls has this example of like counting blades of grass or something like that, like whatever they're content with. Who is the philosopher to say that they should be doing something else, or who's the even psychologist to say that like it's abnormal, it's just sort of what works? So how do you address that sort of, I don't even know if it's an objection, but maybe it's like sort of a proposed counterexample to some of the things that we've mentioned so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I hear that all the time. And I think, if we're looking at how to understand the psychological research, right, what it's telling us is about how people tend to behave, right? So it's definitely speaking in generalizations. Individuals are different. And so anytime we take a psychological claim, it's really important to realize that you could very much sway from that, right? At the same time, I think for some of our most fundamental psychological claims, right, to go back to that need to belong, right, we have so much understanding about that notion has been developed through decades within psychology. And so I tend to take a claim that that's so well established. And you know what? I think there's got to be pretty something exceptional about a person to not to need social interactions, and maybe that's the case, right? But to the person who thinks that they can live in solitude, that they can live in isolation, and that they are living a good life, I would just really encourage them to question whether they are really living a good life, whether or not there could be improvements within their lives by having some social connections. And that's not to say you can't spend a lot of time in solitude. Solitude is actually, I really, it's a great thing. People are doing new research on the benefits of solitude, but it's all a package of things. And so I think that for most of us, it's the basic psychological claims, certainly the ones that are involved in thinking about what helps us flourish. I think they are probably true of us. And so I think, if you are interested in living a good life, then I think you owe yourself to pay attention to what those psychological claims are, and just to see how it goes, right? And you know, I preface that with saying, well, if you are interested in living a good life, you know, I get that many people might not, right? I mean, I tend to think that, you know, we're here on this earth, let's make the best of it. And my own take on the, you know, what makes for a good life, there's certain kind of like fundamental moral needs, but there's also like a lot of range of experiences that we can have. And I think we really should go for it all, right? Barring, you know, obviously it's some things can be challenging, just given our circumstances, but I still think that within all of our capacities to live a really good life, and that it's worth it. And so even if it gets one out of one's comfort zone, right, requires changing things up, experimenting, I think it's worth it.
Good. I want to touch on one of the things that's been sort of like hovering. It's been mentioned, but it's this idea of, you know, satisfaction, being content, flourishing, that sort of thing. And as I understand it, there's historically speaking been a couple main pillars in the, I don't know, flourishing good life literature, and that is of happiness and meaning. And I know that you wrote a whole book on happiness, and so maybe we can take these in order. I want to get your take on what, you know, can you stake out the terrain on the happiness literature and philosophy, and how that has maybe the next question would be like how that intersects with this other pillar that's meaning, and then we'll get to some of your other work. But let's start with happiness. Like, what were you up to in the book? Can you give us a picture of like what's going on with the happiness literature and philosophy in particular?
Yeah, thank you. So um, in philosophy, for a very long time, most people thought about happiness in terms of this Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia. So, for you know, that concept has captured philosophers since day one, and it's only within the past, I'm going to put it like early 1990s, that philosophers have really actually said, okay, well, let's think about happiness, right? The happiness is a concept that we all discuss, right? That we all really think is important in our lives, and let's try to figure out what that is, right? Aristotle's account of eudaimonia is a very kind of robust, normative, very human flourishing type of happiness. But then there's just like hanging out with your friends, being happy, and philosophers, so in the past few decades, right, that's been the real target of trying to understand like what is our state of mind when we are happy. And philosophers have a lot of different views on that. And what they're trying to do is give an explanation of when we experience happiness, right? Why and what's going on. And so within the philosophical literature, we find accounts defending happiness as in terms of pleasure, right? This is a view of hedonism, which also has ancient roots. And it says that, well, a happy life is a pleasant life and it's full of good feelings. Uh, so hedonism was very influential in many areas of philosophy, and it has been one that's really much informed psychological research, and I can come back to that. So hedonism as a philosophical theory of happiness is just going to say the more pleasure the better, right? That's the only thing, and that's what we should be going for. And by that, it doesn't necessarily mean just like bodily stuff, right? Most philosophical hedonists will understand that, you know, our attitudes can be sources of pleasure for us. So if we have a great attitude towards a certain experience, that attitude can really make that pleasant. It can make it pleasurable to experience. So that's a big, so you've got eudaimonia, this historical, robust thing, and then you have hedonism. And then beyond that, philosophers have thought a lot about the importance of desires to happiness, right? So very basic, right? We think that certainly we think that when we desire something, we don't get it, right? That makes a negative impact on our lives. And the flip side is going to be that, well, when we get what we desire, that generates something positive within our lives. And a lot of people think just that state of desire satisfaction is happiness. And so that's a really popular contemporary view. And there are other kinds of philosophical approaches to happiness. I'll just name one that I find really plausible. And this is one defended by Dan Habron, a philosopher at St. Louis University, who really jump-started this contemporary surge of philosophers looking at philosophy. And Dan Habron's view of philosophy, he defends it's called the emotional state theory. Basically, Habron thinks that when we are happy, it's because we are experiencing this kind of state that is very much a robust, engaged state where we experience this kind of resonance with our surroundings and where we really have this sense of fullness and openness within our lives. And what I like about this account is that it does really capture the sense in which, well, when you're happy, it's not just like I don't think necessarily a single thing, right? But it's like you're just happy. Anything that comes your way is going to make you happy. And so I think there's a lot of plausibility to this idea that happiness is an emotional state.
That's helpful. And so the so when I think of the psychological literature, and obviously this isn't my area, so this is going to sound maybe obvious, but like I think of, let's say, like Arthur Brooks's work. He's popularized sort of the happiness literature. You know, been on Oprah, and and teaches at Harvard, and so he's got the academic chops apparently as well. But he's done a lot of the psychological work on happiness. And so maybe a couple of questions are like, what is the relationship between like what you just said and then the psychological literature on happiness? I guess it's more descriptive. And I'm also curious if you've interacted with Arthur Brooks' work at all. And that could be a very easy question, obviously, too.
Yeah, no, I've read a lot of Arthur Brooks' works. He has this column. Is it the New York? He has
Atlantic, yeah.
a column in the Atlantic, and yeah, he has a really nice kind of sense of the field, and really does a nice job of laying things out and looking at different nuances. I will say, so one thing that particularly in his book, Arthur Brooks takes happiness to be more of a comprehensive kind of thing than than is often academically studied, right? So a lot of time, his understanding of happiness is as this very big, authentic state in which you are finding meaning and you are experiencing good feelings and you're satisfying desires, right? So for him, happiness is a larger kind of catch-all phenomenon. And when sometimes philosophers have those kinds of views, right? But the views I've been talking about more have been the philosophical side, have been trying to say, okay, no, let's isolate like happiness and think about it as something that might be different from even well-being, right? And those kinds of nuances philosophers are, all about. And those nuances, though, are also happening within psychology. When psychologists began to study happiness at the outset of the kind of early positive psychology movement, they actually turned to philosophers and they said, okay, well, what's the literature there? And they turned very much to Aristotle and they said, okay, so there are these two kind of things on the table that happiness might be. One is eudaimonia, which we can kind of think about captured in meaning, right? It's that rational engagement. And the other is hedonism, right? Just pleasure. And psychologists, when they're researching happiness, the scales that they tend to use and the concepts that they're focusing on, they describe in terms of subjective well-being. And that's really, marked by a state of positive affect, right? Pleasure and life satisfaction, something that is also just kind of more broad than desire satisfaction, right? But we know it's when you're satisfied with life. And so a lot of the research that psychologists are doing, right, are in what they're doing in the research is they're giving subjects these scales and they're trying to figure out, okay, well, how much positive affect have you been experiencing? How satisfied are your life? And then they're trying to figure out what the circumstances explaining that are. And so a lot of the psychological research really does have this very hedonistic tone towards their understanding of happiness, which I think is plausible. I think that certainly in the ordinary sense, most of us think that, happiness is a state that feels good, right? That's why we want it, right? It's good, it feels good. And so I think that there is something very worthwhile in understanding happiness on those grounds and in researching it. And in my own work, I tend to, given the extent to which I'm in conversation with psychologists, I tend to use their understanding of happiness. So when I talk about happiness, often in my own work, I will be talking about this state of subjective well being marked by positive affect, feelings of satisfaction. And again, that's only one kind of way that philosophers think about happiness. But if you're going to discuss the research, right, and engage with the research, then you got to be using the same terms in the same way.
Good. Okay, so would it be accurate to say, Aristotle had this notion, and wrapped up in it were these ideas of well-being, flourishing, happiness, and meaning, and at least like in the contemporary scene, a lot of people are trying to make that a little bit more fine-grained, so you can separate out the happiness, the meaning, and that sort of thing, and weight it in different ways, and compare like the fundamentality of those different elements, I would assume. So I guess that's the first question. And the second is like, so we've talked about happiness. Where does meaning fit into, I guess, the literature, and in your mind in this, what's the kind of catch-all, flourishing, however you want to describe it, category?
Yeah, thank you. I think so. Within the literature, there are both philosophers and psychologists who embrace this more, I've been calling it, a robust understanding of happiness. Right? It's often called authentic happiness, and it is similar to what Brooks embraces. But something like authentic happiness, whenever you hear somebody talking about something like that, right? What they're adding on to our understanding of basically happiness is good feelings is some dimension of meaning, right? So they'll carve it out in different ways, right? But once you get to the point where you're talking about something like authentic happiness, right, you're going beyond just the kind of superficial feelings that you might experience. And you're really stressing that there has to be something more to one's life than these feelings, and that there has to be some anchor in meaning or in fulfillment, right? And something kind of more rationally based. And so that's, when you hear someone talk about happiness, you should always ask, what do figure out what they're talking about, because who knows what they're talking about. But whenever you hear someone kind of go down the line of like authentic, right, then you know that they're invoking more than just these pleasurable feelings. And with the current landscape, I tend to think that happiness, you know, I think it's a separate thing than meaning. And I think that very early on, when Aristotle is giving his account of eudaimonia, right, he's capturing this, this is a very notion embedded in our lives, that we are rational creatures and that our best lives are going to involve rational activity. And I think that's very important. I just don't think that that's happiness. And I think it's important actually to distinguish between happiness and more rationally based views, which I describe in terms of meaning or fulfillment, right? I think these they contribute different things to our lives. And so I think we're better off just kind of separating them and thinking about how we can get both. And it takes different ways to get both. So I, yeah, so I tend to think that these, views of meaning and fulfillment, higher views of rationality, all right, those are all really important concepts. And I think they're important to something like well being. But if I'm going to talk about happiness, I'm going to talk about that state that feels good, that everyone can accept, right? If you pull someone on the street, they're going to be like, yeah, happiness is a state that feels good. I can't really explain it, but it feels good. And that's what I want to understand when I'm thinking about happiness.
So on the meaning and fulfillment part, could you either give an example or flesh it out a little bit? I mean, I think I have an understanding, but like, how have you found a best way to describe this meaning element? It's very broad, so how do you think of it?
Yeah. I think it's most helpful to think about it as kind of purpose based, right? So we hear a lot, and certainly there's a lot of discourse about finding one's purpose and the importance of having a purpose to one's life, right? It gives you a chance to self direction, it gives you an opportunity to engage your mind in a way that you find meaningful. So when you are engaged in a purpose-driven activity, right? You're aiming at something. And if you're engaging in a purpose-driven activity that's going to deliver meaning, right? You're pursuing some kind of purpose that really you are committed to, that taps into something very kind of deep inside you, such that you think it's a very worthwhile project to have. And so I think in ordinary discourse, I think that the most common way of thinking about this meaning stuff is purpose, right? Like, do you have a purpose in life? Are you just kind of flailing around, not finding that yet? Or very often, I think, people can be happy without having purpose, and then their lives are somewhat one dimensional. Likewise, you can be very purpose driven and not experience a lot of happiness, right? So I think they tap into different parts of us. So I tend to think about meaning a lot in terms of purpose. One really familiar way to philosophy of thinking about meaning is in terms of developing virtue, right, and being good people, right? That we know, I mean, of course, that gives meaning to our lives when we are good people and we treat others well. So that's another kind of way in which we can experience meaning, that I think applies pretty universally. I think most of us will really experience kind of fulfillment or meaning when we are good people, and so I think that's a more universal one. Other kinds of purposes might be more unique to somebody, right? So somebody might devote themselves to Habitat for Humanity and building houses and finding meaning that way. And that's, lots of different great sources of meaning. And some I think are more shared, and others might be really specific to the person.
I want to come back to that, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So my next question, so we have happiness, we have meaning, fulfillment, and I'm curious, when you were doing your work, was there a singular or a cluster of like aha moments where you went, okay, hold on, we have happiness, we have meaning, something might be missing here that's pretty fundamental as well? Like what was the sort of like origin point, if there was one, for continuing this in like your unique way?
Yeah. I wish I could say that I just was sitting there on my own, but like, aha, we are missing all these things. But it didn't happen that way. So I was in collaboration working with a psychologist, and we were on a grant for philosophers and psychologists to come together and think about the good life. And so I was working with psychologist Shige Oshi, and he had the instinct, right, that something was missing, right? That we're talking about meaning so much, and we're talking about happiness, but maybe there was something more. And in all honesty, this was a question, or a possibility that philosophers and psychologists just hadn't really taken that seriously before. And so this was Oshi's hunch that there was something more, and he was thinking along the terms of what he describes in terms of his psychological richness, right? That we have these experiences that are ones in which our minds are very much engaged, and we are really engaged to the point where we are engrossed, we are having new thoughts, we are feeling new emotions, right? Something is just tapped into us. And one interesting thing about those kinds of states is that you don't have to have them in a meaningful way, right? Like, you can have these states just like looking out at a tree. I think that's one of the best ways. I'm from Vermont. We look a lot at trees, but like, you can have a very like psychologically rich experience, right? Because it's just about cognitive engagement. So it doesn't have to be anything meaningful. And also it doesn't always necessarily pleasant, right? We can have rich experiences watching a horror film, right? Where it's not pleasant, but our mind is firing, and that's why we're into it. And so that was Oshi's basic hunch, and it was one of these things where as soon as we started talking about it, I was like, aha, right? This was actually totally totally convincing to me, even from the start of the research, that this was a really important and distinct form of the good life, or a form of valuable experiences. And also that it made a lot of sense of my life. I realized as I'm working about this, I was like, oh yeah, well, that's what I'm getting when I travel, when I'm reading books, when I'm in nature. I'm getting these really psychologically rich experiences, which are interesting, and that's what makes them count. And so for me, the aha was first, prompted, but certainly by Oshi. But then there's a connection, and I think that's probably true of a lot of us, right? We don't have this language. It's not everyday language, psychological richness, but we do think about interesting experiences, and we do know how engaging it is, enjoyable it is to have an interesting experience, and what we've done through our co-authored work, Oshi and I have really tried to show that this is a distinct and different concept than happiness and meaning, and so it deserves its own space in the literature. And I I think that is so important, just in two respects, right? Both so we can recognize these things in ourselves, right? So I meet a lot of people when I talk about this, they're like, yes, I know what that is, and thank you. There's a validation that comes about through knowing that this is actually a very distinct and valuable experience. And there's also a sense in which, putting the language on it helps you to prioritize it, right? Sometimes we can feel really bad if we're just sitting around uh, thinking about trees. But you know what? That's valuable for us. That's really good for us to do. And, our lives don't all have to be all about meaning, right? And they shouldn't be all about happiness, and they can't be. So there's room for all of these things. And so I think this is a really recognizing this dimension of experiences that are really important, are really prudentially valuable to us, is going to allow everyone, no matter where you come from, to get an extra step into the good life, and be able to have much more valuable experiences than just happiness and meaning.
Good. And so maybe part of the claim here is, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but that the happiness. So when we talk about the good life, we think of happiness, we think of meaning, and we've missed this thing: the psychological richness, psychological complexity, that sort of, and the interesting. And maybe those are synonymous. I'll let you respond to that. But that part of the claim is that these are equally fundamental, and so that's my first question. And I know you've probably received some pushback on that. Is the interesting less fundamental than happiness? Because if we have something interesting, maybe it leads to happiness, and then we can think of counterexamples. But I'll start there, just with is that sort of how you think of it? Is there these three elements to the good life, and they're all equally fundamental in some way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there are, in a good life, and here my approach is thinking about, like, what kind of experiences make our lives good. And so I think that, yeah, absolutely, there are three different kinds of experiences that make our lives good, right? There's meaningful ones, there's interesting ones, and there's pleasant ones. It's getting back to that sense of happiness. And I think that they are fundamentally good. And one of the arguments that I've been developing is that psychologically rich states are good because they're interesting. And so one of the things I've been doing in my work is to try to show that interestingness is its own value. It's something simply good to experience. We know it's good to experience through our experience of it. And I think it functions in a very similar way as does pleasure, right? Pleasure is uh, for certainly for hedonists, for many understandings of happiness, right? Pleasure is a value, right? And it's what makes things good. And so I think that interestingness is a value in that same sense in which pleasure is a value, right? It's the feeling that we get when we experience psychological richness. And that's where I want to. Earlier, you'd asked about the relationship between psychological richness and interestingness. And so, a psychologically rich state is fundamentally a description of a state of robust cognitive engagement where you are having stimulating thoughts and emotions. And so, this is the kind of description of a state, but it's a separate question over whether that's good and why it's good. Right? We can have very engaging experiences that actually aren't good. And maybe they're just very anxiety provoking or something like that, right? But when they're good, right, it's because they're interesting. And so I describe the interesting in terms, or interestingness in terms of what it feels like when you're having like a really good, engaging experience, right? So think about your favorite movie, your favorite book, your favorite class, right? Think about how you're engaged with it. Think about what's going on in your mind, but then also think about what it feels like to have that. And it's in the feeling of it, right? That's where it's interesting. That's interestingness. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I want to point people to the book here, The Art of the Interesting. It's not quite for there we go. All
Yeah.
right, it's focusing on it. And so there's so much. I just want to hit some highlights in this book. Really enjoyed it, and I should point out that this is more of a popular level book than your other more academic works, and so it's going to be a little bit more accessible, and so it's a fun read. One of the themes that comes up in the book is these are my words, so you can explain it probably better, but something along the lines of the value of endurance, resilience, facing challenges, facing obstacles. And I'm wondering if you could, and it seems like the interesting kind of, this emphasis on the interesting kind of explains the value of those virtues and the experiences, that the hard and difficult experiences sometimes that cause those virtues or that lead to those virtues. So how do you understand this aspect of the interesting in terms of the good life, related to these? It's sort of trendy now to emphasize resilience and endurance, at least in some
Mhm.
circles. So how do you put those things together?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think there's a number of kind of different contexts in which resilience or something like that is helpful. Uh, I think that what I'm after more is something more like challenge, right? Or the ability to put yourself out there, which definitely requires a sense of resilience. And here's where that comes into play, right? So what we know about psychological richness through our studies of it is that its highest correlations are when someone engages in experiences that are novel, challenging, or complex. And if you think about what those three things do to your mind, right? When you're engaging in something new, it's like you have to think, right? You have to engage, you have to figure it out. Yet your mind naturally responds to novelty in this way that engages it, right? And same too when something is challenging and when something is complex, right? These are all situations when we put ourselves in, they really they force our minds to engage. And a lot of these interesting experiences happen when you get out of your comfort zone, right? When your comfort zone, like happy, safe, boring, right? And that's all good for sometimes, right? But you got to step out of it to sometimes just to really force your mind to engage and to find interesting things. And so zeroing in on challenge then, right? So I do think that challenging, if you are trying to figure out like how can I experience psychological resonance, how can I find an interesting experience, challenge yourself, right? To set something out that is really kind of hard for you, that your mind is going to have to wrap around, uh, engage with things to make sense of the challenge. uh, there's another aspect to which I think thinking about interestingness in terms of challenges is really helpful, though, and that's when you are having a challenging experience. Of course, at part of life, we are all going to have challenging experiences. And the thing about challenging experiences is that they can be very painful, right? They can call into question, the meaning of your life, right? They can really just throw you off, right? And so like present a real obstacles to you when you're in challenges. And a lot of the times when someone's facing a really challenging experience, it's I think we all struggle to help give them advice, right? Because we don't want to belittle the challenge and say, oh no, it's okay, just keep, you shouldn't be so upset about it, right? And so I think that one of the most helpful aspects of this research is that you can take a perspective on your own challenges in life, and view them from this standpoint of just this kind of take an open perspective and engage with it, right? So ask questions, ask yourselves little questions about how you got there, ask little questions about what's going on in the periphery, And bit by bit, this is going to give you a really nice kind of strategy for dealing with challenges in your life. And one of the things I talk about a lot in the book about how we can train our minds so that they will more naturally have interesting experiences, right? I describe a kind of sense of mindfulness, right? Where it's not necessarily a mindfulness. We know mindfulness to be like a state of cognitive, metacognitive awareness and meditation and things like that. But I'm talking about using the skill of mindfulness, right? Which is really a position of non-evaluative awareness, right? And noticing things in your world, right? And taking that kind of position, taking that mindset, right? Where you're not in it to evaluate, right? You're not in it to say, oh, good or bad, right? You're doing something different, right? And you're just exploring it, right? That I think helps us to engage with the challenges that we're facing in a way that can really be helpful to us, towards wrapping our head around them, or just dealing with them. We don't, yeah, we're not going to try to make them good, right? But it gives us this kind of perspective, and I think that goes down to like really honing in on the sense in which we can engage with things from this non-evaluative perspective, right? I think we all get in these modes where everything is good or everything is bad, but uh, if everything is good or bad, then you just stop the story there, right? And so you can kind of resist getting that immediate evaluation and being like, okay, well, let me think about what this is, right? And not just that it is good or bad. And taking that step, I think, is an important step towards just having more interesting experiences, but it's also really valuable when we're dealing with these challenges.
I'm glad you mentioned mindset. That was going to be one of my questions, this sort of like interesting mindset. I was curious when I was reading some of that in the book. Have you thought about the relation between that sort of mindset and the literature on like growth mindset that comes from like neuroscience and psychology?
Yeah, I think they're very parallel in their starting points, right? So growth mindset is all about kind of getting out of your comfort zone, engaging with challenging experiences so that you can grow, right? And that's all super important. What I'm talking about is something a little more fundamental, right? That's getting out of your comfort zone, engaging challenging experiences, engaging with challenge so that you can find something interesting, right? And so to have just an interesting experience, it'll trickle down and lead to growth and will change us in many ways. But I think there's something really valuable to be said about, oh, just have an interesting experience. Get out of your comfort zone. This is what we do when you travel, right? Just pop ourselves in the middle of a foreign country, right? We're going to have an interesting experience. And yes, we're going to grow, but in the moment, right? I think it's so important to appreciate that in the moment, what we're doing is something like having a really valuable experience that's enhancing our lives. And so I think they start right from the same perspective, right? And they involve a lot of the same kind of things. Yet there's a sense in which the growth mindset is building towards something, whereas interestingness is just something there to experience, maybe as we grow.
That's great and super helpful. And it made me think of like that example that we mentioned in the beginning. So when you have these sorts of things in mind, the challenging, and you were to, let's say, advise someone who, again, is just sort of like addicted to the algorithm, they're on their phone, they're scrolling, and maybe it seems like they're content, or maybe it seems like it's interesting stuff because all these videos are maybe sort of novel in a way, but like, how would you sort of like assess and advise someone who goes, look, this is sort of like taking too much time in my life? Would you characterize it as interesting? How should I pivot or not? What do you say to that sort of situation, that sort of
Yeah.
person?
Yeah, no, that's a big one, right? And I like the phrase people often use for that, which is like doom scrolling, right? Where you're not getting anything out of it. If anything, you're just getting doom, right? But this whole sense of which when that's happening, we're scrolling, right? We're just scrolling through thing after thing without letting our minds land on anything. And I think that's why the experience of scrolling is so empty, right? I think that it just makes you feel empty because you're just like, dude, you're just going. And so I think there are ways. to change that, right? To even ways without putting down your phone, right? I mean, that would be an easy way, but we can have interesting experiences on our phones, right? I mean, and even if you just stop the scrolling, right? Even if you're just doing your thing and just find yourself doing it, and be like, oh no, stop, right? And then even just, play games with yourself. Be like, okay, I'm not going to turn for 2 minutes, and then just try to engage, let yourself land on something and think about, and then as you're doing that, like, appreciate what's going on in your mind and learn to recognize, right, when you're getting into this kind of mindless scrolling where you think you're kind of using your mind, but you're not. It's all autopilot, nothing's landing. And then recognize the difference between when you land and when you land on something, and it hits your mind and you're allowing it to go to penetrate your thoughts and engage with it. So I think even just, playing games, like pause, set a timer if you want to, do whatever game you need to do to help you stay there. That's really valuable. I think another just trick, again, if you don't, still even using your phone, right, is just to like pull up random pages and see what your mind's landing on. There are, when I was doing this research, I Googled, like, what are some interesting things, right? There's so many lists of interesting things out there. And so you can even just Google that, right? And then just read the list. And one of the neat things about doing that kind of a thing is that, you'll be able to, I mean, it's a very directed activity that'll land in interestingness. But you'll also be able to tell, like, when something hits you and when something doesn't, even on that list, right? So you can just go through a long list of random facts, and some of them will just be like no big deal, but others you'll be like, oh gosh, that's interesting, right? And again, that's going to help train you to know a little bit about yourself, what you find interesting, but it's also going to help you recognize this kind of feelings of interesting arising. And once you hone into those, right, then you can really embrace them and allow them to kind of bloom and take over. But it does take really being able to distinguish in your own experiences, like when you are engaging in something that could be interesting or when you're just scrolling. And so I think even those two things, even, and you didn't even need to put your phone down to do any of those. But of course, if you put your phone down, then I think that a lot I think you'll find that you can have a lot more interesting experiences than you think you could. And one of the things I really advocate in the book is how it is that you can be in just your regular, ordinary lives. And if you just change your mindset a little bit, right, so that you are noticing things out there and then you're engaging with them, you're asking why, you're allowing those things to trickle, you can have an interesting experiences in the most, familiar aspect of your lives, right? In your town, I've been in this office now for 18 years, I think. And I guarantee you I could have, in very little time, like, look around and find something interesting to engage with. So anyone who's listening to us now can do that. You can keep listening because this is interesting, but just noticing little things around your area, you can find something interesting. And that, I think, is so important to learn and to realize that's an ability that you have, and it's independent of needing other things to stimulate you. It's independent of needing a phone to connect you to bigger places or whatever. It's independent of having to travel, right? It's just, you can create interesting experiences just by noticing things, being curious about them, and engaging.
So then, what's the place for like interesting burnout? I know you talk about that a little bit because I mean you can imagine someone just perpetually trying to chase this interesting hit, and it's easy to imagine that someone can get kind of carried away with that. So how do you strike that balance with like chasing it on some level but not burning out on it?
Yeah, yeah. And I think there's two sides to that question. So one firsthand is the idea of kind of like chasing interesting experiences. I think very often, certainly for a certain kind of person, but very often, like if you're listening to this now, someone might reasonably be thinking, okay, I have to go out on this kind of real adventure. I have to go like skydiving to have an interesting experience and things like that. Um, and the what's happening when you kind of go out for those really high stimulating experiences, right, is much more so that you are pursuing kind of like a sensation, right? And so you can, be sensation seeking, and that's what I would describe as happening in terms of those very kind of extreme cases where you go to extremes just to be stimulated. And it's since sensational experiences don't always land that well in our minds, right? People who engage in a lot of those activities, right, they're very much tend to suffer, mental health consequences because of just the way in which they're always kind of like chase this high, and then it just becomes this kind of loop, much like an addiction kind of loop that's never really hitting, right, because it's all just happening at the level of sensations. So you got to be careful if you're the person who's thinking, skydiving and all these things. I mean, those are awesome experiences, right? But just make sure that you're not just seeking sensation. Interesting experiences happen in the mind, not the body. So keep an eye on that. And but yes, because interesting experiences happen in the mind, right? There will be a limit to the interesting experiences we can have, right? Something can be so interesting, it can just engross you or engage you and keep you going and going. But at a certain point, your mind's going to fry out, right? You might still keep going, but you're not going to get anything valuable out of it. And so I think that, again, knowing who you are and where you're going to land, right? One story I talk about in the book is like very long-term travelers, right? So they have, they're putting themselves, they're having the most interesting experiences, and yet they're so long-term traveling that their minds can, they kind of fry out. There's only so much mental stimulation you can take. And so I think it really is going to help to recognize, when you're fried out and when you're not getting anything from those experiences that should be interesting, but somehow you're just like going through the motions. So the interestingness is limited by your mind's capacity to engage cognitively. And I think that's a wonderful capacity with much greater resources than other kinds of capacities we might have, but it's still a capacity. So we got to give our minds time to rest.
Yeah, you say in the book, I have it here. You say the surest way to miss the interesting is to chase it head on. Going back to your previous point, you also say that in another place. So to come back to purpose, um, I did have a question. So you say that finding your single unique purpose is not a good idea, or something like that. I might be paraphrasing. So coming back to purpose here and relating it to the interesting, why do you think that attempt to find your single unique purpose is off track in some way?
Yeah. I mean, I think it puts a lot of pressure on ourselves, right? There's a lot of discourse about, finding your unique purpose. Everyone's got one, and hearing all of that makes one think, okay, I got to find mine, right? And I got to go out there and really just try to figure out what that is, uh, and that doesn't always end well, right? So I worry. I don't know that there's a single unique purpose for everybody, and I think you're really lucky if you find it, right? But if you are like just sitting there being like, I got to figure out my purpose, I'd really recommend not to just kind of like let off the pursuit, let yourself off the hook. You can have some interesting experiences, you can have pleasant experiences, you can have fulfilling experiences, meaningful ones, without necessarily fulfilling your purpose. You can help somebody, you can do volunteer work for an afternoon, right? You can get fulfillment in your life without necessarily finding your one unique purpose. And I think that I think that's so important. I do see a lot of young adults really just struggle, right? Because they think they gotta find it, and it maybe it's there, maybe it's not. But I think you're lucky when you find it. So you're better off, don't like say you're never going to find your purpose, right? But don't actually really spend a lot of time thinking that you have to have it, or or intentionally going about trying to discover it. I just don't think that's going to pay off for most of us.
I want to ask a question about boredom. It seems like the other side of this coin, and I'm wondering. I want to get to your upcoming work, but maybe I can sort of transition with this topic of boredom. It seems to me, this is just anecdotal, but it just seems to me that experientially, from where I sit with students, that there's sort of this. I don't know if it's an epidemic of boredom, but it seems like an increase in the amount of boredom and the frequency of getting bored and that sort of thing. Um, is there, well, one is, have you looked at like the psychological literature on boredom? I'm not familiar with that at all, but how do you think about boredom and maybe in this idea of interesting as part of the good life as sort of an antidote to something that seems to be increasing in our culture?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that boredom, we all have experienced it, right? But it's not always clear like what's happening when we're bored, right? We know that nothing's happening in our minds, right? And I think that we can really help ourselves out by really understanding what boredom is. And so, on my analysis, boredom is the experience you're having when you your mind wants to engage with something, but it can't. So you've got this kind of conflict. Your mind is like seeking engagement. Our minds do this, right? They seek engagement. And boredom arises when your mind wants to engage, but it just can't. And that's why we experience it aversively. And I want to distinguish between that kind of lack of engagement sense of boredom that I think is more apt from this kind of like stillness, right? I think sometimes people talk like, oh, it's good to be bored. Like, I think what you're saying is it's good to just kind of like check out and relax your mind. Uh, but that's not boredom, right? That's just a peaceful, perhaps mindful state. And but engagement is the decisive thing, I think, with boredom, right? If your mind is striving to be engaged, if you feel an urge to engage and you can't land, then that's how we experience boredom, and it's aversive. And so I think that part of why we might see more occurrences, or more we might be more talking about boredom more now in our current environment, perhaps has to do with a real kind of lack of appreciation for what it is to engage, right? Go back to that, and I think here's where, smartphones have not helped us out, right? We think, I will tell a funny story. I was giving a talk, and out with some graduate students beforehand, and I was giving a talk on boredom. And this graduate student goes, it's like, don't you think that's a kind of old fashioned topic? And I was like, all right, well, I'm talking about a paper from 1970, right? And he's like, no, he's like, I don't think I've ever been bored. He's never bored because he can always pull out his phone and do something. And I think that's a really, I mean, credit to this guy for being so brazen about it, but it really made me think, right? And it is, I think we are so used to thinking, well, we're never bored. We always have something to do. But what we're doing when we pull out our phones is not actually engaging, right? We're scrolling. Most often we're just scrolling. We're getting something useless out of it. And so I feel like through our phone usage, we've really forgotten what it feels like to engage. And so we substitute. We think we're engaging because we're like scrolling, right? But we're moving our finger basically, right? And our mind's not landing. And so I think that we can really understand, what engagement is and what it's not, and then come to realize that a lot of the things we might think are engaging or alleviating boredom aren't, right? If you're bored and you pull out your phone and you just start scrolling, right, at best you're distracting yourself, and so maybe it doesn't feel that bad, but you're not engaging, and I think that's where we need to start talking more about the difference between things that distract us and things that engage us. And I worry that a lot of people think that the things that distract us are, substitutes for engagement when they're not. They're just taking our mind off something. And they're not, again, we want to land when we engage. We want to like have a thought and hit it and go back and forth. So Yeah, so that's why I think perhaps we're talking a lot more about boredom now, and I think that the next helpful step is to think a lot more about what boredom is in terms of having a lack of engagement, and then understanding it's a lack of engagement. We need to engage to alleviate it, and then to know what that is to engage.
To me, that is such a helpful frame. That's so, because when we think of the kind of person that we have in mind, they're doing an activity, sure, and there might be something, all things considered, interesting on the screen, but the idea of boredom that doesn't have this desire element, you can obviously see that there is a lack. So what's like lacking there? I think you're right. The engagement, and there is a desire for something else than just sort of an activity in front of you. That doesn't seem to cut it on the desire level, because this person is going, I'm scrolling, I'm still bored. So what is it that's missing? That seems like it makes all the sense in the world to me.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
I wanted to maybe end with what kind of work on boredom is are you working on right now? Like what's the research? Is it popular level? Is it more academic? Is it a mix? And what sort of insights are you bringing? And again, I'm so interested in this all of a sudden because I didn't think of it as a its own like body of literature, either psychologically or philosophically. So I'm really interested. Like, what are you working on? Where is this going?
Yeah, thank you. Well, with respect to boredom, so I did just recently have a paper come out in this wonderful volume on ill-being. Right? So they all talk about well-being, and now let's think about ill-being. So like the bad states, right? Uh, and so I do develop. I have an article there that is really kind of like the foundation of my thoughts on boredom. And one important thing that I do in that article is to really distinguish or isolate the role of desires. So for some philosophical accounts, right, for most of the philosophical accounts, they're really heavily based in desires, right? So you are bored because you have some kind of like unfulfilled desire, or you are bored because you have a desire that can't be fulfilled, or something like that, right? But so there's a large history of folks who are talking about boredom. Again, going back to that 1970 paper, for a long time, this is a paper by Bernard Williams. For a long time, that was like the latest thing that was happening in boredom. Now there's more philosophers working on it, and more psychology. And so I think that understanding again it as its own unique mental state that is independent of having desires or even having meaning in life, right? There's all of these kind of contexts of like existential boredom where you're so bored because you can't find meaning. Like, okay, well, maybe you can't find meaning, but you can still engage. And so that's what I want to say about boredom, that it's really just all about engagement. And so, with some of the future or the work I'm working, the projects I'm involved in now, I'm thinking a lot about how it is. This is more the kind of flip side of boredom, right? But it is about this sense in which, when you are actively engaged with the world, with things around you, with people, how you develop a more expansive sense of self, right? And so I think, we can go back to those boredom states, right? When you're in a bored state, you're really just kind of like shrinking, right? You're just not, you're isolating, you're shrinking, you're just thinking, I just need something. Um, and the kinds of things that will engage you, right, are these different kind of connections that we can make with our environments. And by that, I just mean like noticing things in our environments. There was this great article that, or research project that someone had with psychological richness, which was trying to figure out uh, the connections between psychologically rich experiences and self expansion. And what they found was that through psychologically rich experiences, because you're really engaging with the world around you, right, you develop a more expansive sense of self. You feel more in touch with things around you. And then amazingly, this is the really cool part, when you have a more expansive sense of self, you feel like you're more in charge. And so, one thing that this research found was that the more psychological rich experiences you have, the more self expansion you feel, the more motivated you are to combat climate change. That was the goal of this, to try to figure out whether or not being in connection with the world, just mentally engaging it, right? Not finding meaning or purpose, just engaging, connecting with the world. It gives you this kind of sense of more, a greater sense of, self and engagement, and agency, right, over the world that does turn out to lead people to be more motivated to engage in climate change. But for me, this idea of self expansion through the mental connections we make with the world, that's just fascinating. And so that's my next direction, to really think about what this nature of self expansion is, and certainly thinking about interesting experiences of way in there. Boredom, I think there's a great analysis to be had about how boredom is creates the opposite of an expansive self, right? How you just kind of shrink when you are bored. You're just, there's nothing happening. You are not able to connect with anything, including your world. And so I think there's a lot of really great, really good things to pursue there. And it's more this, it's more again, this like a psychological aspect or the experiential aspect of living your, very best lives, right? What is it like to do that? And I think self expansion is a really helpful framework for thinking about how we can really be there more in our lives.
Lorraine Besser, it's so fascinating. The topic, the book, your work, your upcoming work. I really appreciate the time. There's so much that people can use and apply. It's such an applicable topic. Obviously, it sort of affects everyone. I want to point people to whatever you want. I know you have a website, but like, where can people find your work, and what can they expect to look for that's coming out for you maybe in the future?
Yeah, thank you. I have a website, lorrainebesser.com, and I'm on social media, Instagram and LinkedIn, probably most off. You can find me easily. Uh, so the kind of work, everything's on my website, but I've been doing a combination of different projects. So I've been writing a lot of, or several public articles for news pieces about little aspects of this research. So I wrote one recently for the conversation about this nature of self expansion. I have a blog on Psychology Today, so you can find a lot of just short pieces about, and that's really very much focused on, the title is Living Your Best Possible Life. So that's definitely like a lot of resources there for ideas that are in the book, but also the newer ideas I have about self expansion.
Excellent. Well, thanks again for the time. I really appreciate it. Enjoyed talking to you, and we'll look out for your work. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jared. This was great.